So we all kind of have this picture in our heads, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days in October 1962, the world holding its breath, teetering on the very edge of nuclear war. And at the center of it all, President John F. Kennedy, the hero who, with a steady hand, pulled us all back from the brink. It's this epic story of American grit and cool-headed resolve.
I mean, listen to how his own biographer, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., put it. He dazzled the world. That quote right there, it perfectly bottles the legend we've all come to know. Kennedy, the master statesman, cool as a cucumber under just unbelievable pressure. And then, of course, there's the line, the one everyone knows, from Secretary of State Dean Rusk. We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. It just conjures this image of a high-stakes, Wild West standoff, a battle of sheer will that America won because, well, the Soviets blinked first. That's the heroic story we've been told our whole lives.
But what if that simple, heroic narrative isn't the whole story? What if the public victory we all celebrate was actually built on a foundation of deep secrets and backroom compromises? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into.
Okay, so to really get what happened during those 13 days, you first have to understand the man in the middle of it all. And not just as a president, but as a true master of the media. JFK literally knew how to write his own history as it was happening. You see, way before he was the one making headlines, John F. Kennedy was the one writing them. That's right, he was a journalist. He covered the huge Potsdam conference after World War II for Hearst newspapers, and that experience, it gave him this incredible, inside-out understanding of how the press machine really works, how you feed it a story, how you frame it, and ultimately, how you shape the narrative.
His administration got so good at this, in fact, that a brand new term was coined just to describe what they were doing: news management. And this wasn't just about sending out press releases. No, this was a full-on professional strategy for controlling what the public heard, making sure that the White House's version of the story was the one that stuck.
So how'd they pull it off? Well, historians talk about this carrot and stick approach. It was pretty simple, really. The carrot, if you were a friendly journalist, you'd get invited to these glamorous White House parties, you'd get exclusive scoops, all that insider access. But the stick? If you wrote something critical, boom, your access was cut off. Just like that. It was an incredibly effective way to keep the press corps in line.
And Kennedy learned this lesson the absolute hardest way. After the total disaster that was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, he said this famous line. He got it. When things go south, no one wants to take the blame. And he was determined that in the next big crisis, he wouldn't be left an orphan of defeat. He was going to control the narrative and be the father of a victory.
So fast forward to 1962. When those spy planes came back with photos of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, Kennedy's press playbook went into overdrive. This crisis wasn't just about managing a nuclear threat. It was about managing the story of that threat. The administration's framing was brilliant in its simplicity. These were unprovoked, offensive missiles. This was pure Soviet aggression, period. But the Soviets had their own story, one the White House called a preposterous tale. They said the missiles were purely defensive, a direct response to the Bay of Pigs and America's ongoing secret plan, called Operation Mongoose, to get rid of Castro.
Now, a huge part of the public argument was that these missiles were a game changer, that they could tip the whole balance of power. But was that actually true? Not even close. At that moment in history, the United States had a mind-boggling nuclear advantage over the Soviets. The ratio was about 17-1. The missiles in Cuba didn't really change the math of nuclear war, but Kennedy knew something crucial. Appearances contribute to reality, and the appearance of a threat was a very powerful political tool.
And that brings us to the real heart of the matter, the part of the story that was very, very deliberately left out of that heroic legend, the secret deal that actually brought the crisis to an end.
So to you, to me, to the rest of the world, Kennedy was an iron wall. The message was loud and clear. There would be no negotiating, no deals. The Soviets had to back down, and it had to be unconditional.
But behind the scenes, a completely different play was being run. The president's brother, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, opened up a top-secret back channel. He started meeting with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, to figure a way out of this mess.
And they struck a deal. Here's what it was. The Soviets would publicly remove their missiles from Cuba for the whole world to see. And in return, the U.S. agreed to secretly, quietly, remove its own Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey a few months later.
So you see, it wasn't a staring contest where one guy blinked. It was a trade, a secret swap.
Just how secret was this deal? Get this. Of all the top advisors on Kennedy's executive committee, the so-called XCOM, only 9 people knew the whole truth, just a tiny inner circle, and the entire deal depended on the Soviets never, ever talking about it.
Okay, so the crisis is over, the world breathes a sigh of relief. And immediately the Kennedy administration gets to work, making sure their version of the story, the tough, no-compromise version, becomes the official first draft of history.
This next part is just incredible. So shortly after the crisis, a huge article drops in the Saturday Evening Post, and it just tears into the UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson. It paints him as this weak, appeasing figure for, get this, for suggesting a trade of American missiles in Turkey for Soviet missiles in Cuba. The article says the very idea was naive and dangerous.
And here is the absolute jaw-dropper. Not only had Kennedy just done the exact thing the article was criticizing, but his own administration had secretly fed the story to the journalists. Think about that. They used the press to publicly attack the very compromise they had just secretly made, all to cover their tracks.
And the effort to protect this myth didn't stop there. It went on for decades. It wasn't until 1989 that Kennedy's own speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, finally admitted that he had deliberately edited the details of the secret missile swap out of Robert Kennedy's famous memoir, 13 Days, all to protect the legacy.
So, okay, why does any of this matter now? I mean, it's a 60-year-old story. Well, it matters because this carefully built myth cast a very long and very damaging shadow over American foreign policy.
The legend of the Cuban Missile Crisis taught a really powerful but really dangerous lesson. It made it seem like the only way to win in a crisis is through pure, unyielding toughness. It made diplomatic compromise look like weakness. And historians argue that this set a terrible precedent. It put this immense pressure on later presidents, like Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, who felt they couldn't possibly negotiate or back down because they'd be seen as soft compared to Kennedy's tough guy legacy.
And that really leaves us with a huge, fundamental question. Look, we can all agree that some secrecy was probably necessary to stop a nuclear war. But the real story here shows how secrecy used to protect a country can bleed into deception used to build a political myth. So where is that line? It's a question that is just as important today as it was back in 1962.